Southerners relied on European recognition and intervention in the conflict, and many elites in Europe were sympathetic to their cause. However, King Cotton eventually failed. By 1861, British factories had a huge surplus of raw cotton, and during the war, exports from Egypt and India began to replace the need for Southern cotton. Following the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, the war also became a battle to free the slaves, and many in England identified with this war aim. Both Union and Confederate forces believed the war would be short. This idea was shattered following some of the early engagements of the war. The first battle involved Union troops, led by General Irwin McDowell, against Confederates, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, at the First Battle of Bull Run. Crowds of spectators gathered to watch this engagement, and initially Union troops gained ground. When Confederate reinforcements arrived, under the command of Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, it turned into a rout as Union troops retreated in chaos. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, was important for both sides. Union troops became determined never to allow another humiliating defeat again. For Confederates, it boosted their confidence as they were convinced victory would be theirs in a short period of time. Later in 1861, Lincoln replaced McDowell with George B. McClellan, who was charged with organizing the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was an excellent organizer who transformed the men into a disciplined force. He was loved by the troops, but proved to be extremely cautious as fighting continued in the East. Union forces were more successful in the West. At Shiloh, Union troops were led by General Ulysses S. Grant, who planned an attack on an important railroad junction in Corinth, Mississippi, on the border with Tennessee. In April 1862, Confederate forces staged a surprise attack on Grant's army. Corinth is underlined on the map here, while the arrow points to Shiloh. In the ensuing engagement, the Confederates were successful until Union reinforcements arrived. The fighting was incredibly bloody. Overall, the battle involved over 77,000 soldiers, and 23,000 were either killed or wounded. Back in the Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was on the offensive, and by late September, his troops had invaded Maryland. Lee hoped to gain much-needed supplies as crops were ready for harvest in western Maryland, and believed the Confederacy might receive recognition from European nations if they defeated Union troops on northern soil. The ensuing engagement at Antietam was even more deadly than Shiloh. From a tactical perspective, Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg, was a draw, but strategically it was a northern victory. Lee's invasion had been stopped, and Europeans would not consider recognition of the Confederacy at that time. Overall, the fighting resulted in about 24,000 American casualties, the bloodiest single day of fighting in the war. Antietam was important for diplomatic reasons as well. For some time, Lincoln had reconsidered his views concerning the war and slavery. Over his entire political career, he had been morally opposed to slavery, yet he did not support abolition. He believed the institution of slavery would die on its own if it didn't expand. As the war continued and the death tolls rose, Lincoln drafted a proclamation to free the slaves, but he waited for a Union victory to announce this new policy. 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that slaves living in states in rebellion against the Union were free. It did not free slaves in states which remained loyal to the Union. The proclamation would go into effect January 1, 1863. Once again, Lincoln demonstrated his political skill. First, by declaring that only slaves in states rebelling against the Union were freed, he was able to secure the support of the border states while pressuring them toward emancipation. The proclamation itself really had no force of law because Lincoln had no authority in the states of the Confederacy. But it transformed the Union war aims. They were no longer fighting to preserve the Union. Now, they were fighting to free slaves. We can now explore life for soldiers fighting in the Civil War. Governments in both Richmond and Washington, D.C. were able to raise armies with volunteers, but they were also forced to implement a draft. The Enrollment Act, implemented in 1863 in the North, made all men aged 20 to 45 eligible for the draft. Exemptions were allowed for many, but more controversial were provisions allowing a draftee to hire a substitute to serve in his place. Furthermore, if one could not find a substitute, draftees could pay $300 to avoid service in the Army. This prompted cries of, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight." It also led to draft riots in some areas, the largest of which took place in New York City. In the summer of 1863, many white, working-class men took to the streets. Well-dressed white men, African Americans, and leading supporters of the war were targeted by mobs during 3 nights of rioting. Several were injured, and at least 6 African Americans were lynched. Similar riots took place in Detroit, but they weren't as large. The Confederacy also implemented a draft in 1862. It was similar to the Union's, but also included a 20 Negro law provision. This allowed any planter who owned at least 20 slaves to be exempt from the draft. By 1863, those exempted by this provision were required to pay $500, but there was still a great deal of resentment, particularly on the part of poor whites living in the South. As you can see from this chart comparing the armies of both the Union and Confederacy, the Union was able to assemble much larger armies. Also, while each employed a draft and allowed for substitutes of some sort, most soldiers were volunteers on both sides. Beginning in 1862, African American troops were allowed to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, over 180,000 African Americans had served. Even in the Union Army, they faced discrimination as they fought in segregated units, and their pay was lower than that for white soldiers. Camp life was known for its drudgery, but it could also be dangerous. Drinking water could easily be contaminated, and diseases such as dysentery and typhoid fever were common. On the side, we see a camp of Union soldiers. Food for Union troops often consisted of beans, salted pork, pickled beef, and hardtack, hard biscuits made of water and flour. Here we see some Confederate soldiers. Their diet usually included bacon and cornmeal. Rebel soldiers always seemed to be short on supplies, whether they be food, blankets, or shoes. For both sides, the brutality of combat transformed them if they were lucky enough to have survived the fighting. Medical care for soldiers injured in the field of battle often consisted of amputation of limbs. Injured soldiers might, or might not, receive chloroform as an anesthetic. It's estimated about 30% of amputees died following surgery, usually due to infection. The hospital shown here was an improvement over those found near the field of battle. Some of the worst conditions facing soldiers might be found in prisoner of war camps. The most notorious was Andersonville, located in Georgia. The facility was designed to handle 10,000 soldiers, yet by the summer of 1864, over 30,000 were imprisoned at the camp. It's believed 14,000 died at Andersonville alone during the war. I visited Andersonville. It's a powerful facility, which also includes a prisoner of war museum. I highly recommend it if you can make it there.